Hi, welcome back to the second part of the first lesson in the series of lessons about classroom assessment. In this part, we are going to learn about different types of assessment. There are different ways to categorize assessment as well as to name them. Today, we'll get familiar with the most common one, which divide assessment into three types: assessment of learning, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning. Let's start with the first type, assessment of learning, which may be more familiar with you by the name summative assessment. This type of assessment aims to check whether the learners have met the requirement as set by measuring knowledge or skills by the total number of items answered correctly, or in other words, how much learning is evidenced in their test results. A judgment will be made by comparing the predetermined learning targets and the ultimate performance of the learner. The major focus is on the product of learning. Assessment of learning is commonly associated with exams and formal tests, as it is to collect evidence for a summative judgment of students' performance. The feedback to students usually comes in the form of marks or grades. Let's move on to the second type of assessment, assessment for learning, or we often refer it to formative assessment or ongoing assessment. Assessment for learning aims to understand how learners learn, what learner can do or cannot do in order to make some deliberations and decisions on how to help them learn. The emphasis of this type of assessment is the process of learning.
Welcome to Assessment as Learning. Prepared for eTech 510, February 2015. As we get into our discussion about assessment as learning, a number of questions will arise, and I hope to answer as many of those as I can. Most notably, people often ask, assessment as learning, is there some other kind of assessment? As it turns out, there are in fact a number of different types of assessment. Commonly, assessment is discussed as assessment of learning, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning. In order to explain and contextualize assessment as learning, it helps to compare it in practice to assessment of and for learning. This presentation will briefly illustrate those types of assessment. Then, assessment as learning will be demonstrated. As you just saw, that was assessment of learning. It's pretty typical, doing standard tasks and assessing whether or not a student achieved them, or handing out tests and grading students' scores. Assessment of learning in this way has become quite typical in many educational settings. Unfortunately, there are a lot of problems with this, as this is not an effective way to measure one's ability to communicate and manipulate prescribed learning outcomes.
So, this is the first class on your unit on static electricity. Static is a very important thing to learn about.
I know.
We'll see about that. You see, I suspect you don't actually know that much about the proposed topic, so I will do some formative assessment, also known as assessment for learning.
Okay, go ahead.
I will use the results of this assessment to inform my planning and adapt my lessons for the remainder of the unit.
Sounds good.
So does anyone know what static electricity is?
Well, I think static electricity is a stationary electric charge built up on an insulating material.
Well, yes, that is technically correct. But can you tell me what it is used for?
Of course. One of the most interesting uses is in pollution control and smokestacks.
Aha! I see you really don't know anything about static after all. That is not true.
On the contrary, many factories give smoke and exhaust an electric charge before leaving the smokestack. Then they provide an opposite charge near the mouth of the stack.
Are you making this up?
No. Then the negatively charged smoke particles attach themselves to positively charged plates, thereby reducing the amount of particulate matter released into the atmosphere.
Interesting. Just as I thought. You don't know very much, and I will have to use the same lesson plans I've been using for the last 15 years.
So, much like assessment of learning, assessment for learning does have some problems. First and foremost, teachers don't necessarily use the information that they gather from students to effectively change their planning. And second, much like assessment of learning, the results are fairly surface-oriented and don't gather rich information about the students. In this scene, the teacher, shown here, will be talking to the students, shown here. You will see that unlike assessment of and for learning, assessment as learning, the teacher takes on a different role. The teacher's role becomes one where he or she can guide and facilitate opportunities for learning. He or she can encourage self-assessment and reflection, and provide ideas and feedback for the students. Oh, hi everyone! Gather up! So how's it going over here? Super good! We developed compost to make our plants grow stronger. And what about over here? Not great. We spent so much time amending our soil that we forgot to give it lots of water. Ah, yes. Maybe try a little more water.
Finally, assessment as learning. The most common term when we talk about assessment as learning is self-assessment. This type of assessment aims to enable learners to become autonomous learners. That is, it requires learners be aware of what is expected from them, monitor and assess their own learning during the learning process. With the information they obtain, they can regulate their learning to meet the goals that set earlier. Therefore, assessment occurs when students reflect on and monitor their progress to inform their future learning goals. So, you can easily tell that assessment as learning stresses the learner's active role in learning. Alright, we have just investigated 3 different types of assessment. Now, can you tell the differences between these 3 types of assessment? The first difference of these 3 types is what to assess, or in other words, what kind of information is collected. Well, as you probably remember what we have learned earlier today, assessment of learning provides information about what students have learned. Meanwhile, assessment for learning provides information about student progress and learning needs. And assessment as learning provides information concerning student cognitions about their own learning. The second difference is the role of teachers in the process of assessment. As for assessment of learning, teachers need to use such tools as quiz, tests, or exams in order to reveal learners' level of understanding, or check whether students have met the learning target by measuring how much learning is evidenced in their test results. However, in assessment for learning, teachers' main responsibility is to provide clear learning targets and descriptive feedback. And related to assessment as learning, teachers show students how to do self-assessment, provide them with opportunities to practice self-monitoring and self-reflections, as well as guide students in setting learning goals. Another difference lies in the questions of the role of students in the process of assessment. In assessment of learning, teacher assesses students' learning, and students are not directly involved in assessment process. In contrast, the assessment of learning, the teachers and students work together to assess learning. And in terms of assessment as learning, it is students who assess their own learning. In other words, students are actively involved in monitoring and assessing their learning. Another difference is when to do assessment. Both assessment for learning and assessment as learning are continuous processes, which means assessment happens throughout classes, semesters, or even academic years. Assessment of learning, on the other hand, often occurs at the end of a unit or course. Finally, concerning students' learning and motivation. Both assessment for learning and assessment as learning have positive effects. On contrary, assessment of learning may increase or decrease students' motivations, and this type of assessment doesn't emphasize on improving students' learning. So, we have learned about the differences of the 3 types of assessment in terms of the ultimate goal of each type, their information collected in the assessment process, the roles of teachers and students, as well as the time to carry out assessment. I believe now you can tell the benefits and the drawbacks of each type, and you are able to reflect on your own experience of teaching, especially assessing, to decide which type of assessment should be promoted more in your class or truly improve your students' learning. Well, that's the end of the second mini lesson. In the next part, we are going to learn different types of tests.